Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this morning to offer some reflections with respect to Bill C-8. I'd like to start with some of what I appreciate about what's in this bill. Specifically, I think we can all agree that in the midst of a pandemic, adding more ventilation and more supports is a good thing. In this bill is $100 million to improve ventilation in schools. There's also a refundable tax credit on taxes payable for up to 25% of ventilation expenses for small businesses. In addition, I really appreciate that in the bill it includes $1.72 billion for provinces to allocate rapid tests to expand school and workplace testing. In Waterloo Region, for example, the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce just last month shared that they're short on 200,000 rapid tests. And this is the kind of support that I know businesses in my community will really appreciate. Now, when it comes to housing, in Kitchener, house prices went up 35% the last year alone. Back in 2005, the average house price was around 3 times median income. The last year it rose to 8.7 times median income. No doubt house prices are skyrocketing out of control. And whether it's young people who are concerned that they might not ever be able to purchase a home of their own, seniors on fixed income who are anxious in my community with respect to whether they'll be able to stay, or even a nurse I spoke with last summer who shared that her rent is going up too. And she wondered to me if she'd be able to stay in our community at all. And so we need policies that address this crisis head on to ensure that homes are primarily, first and foremost, homes should be for people to live in and not commodities for investors to trade. One of the problems we have in this crisis is the number of vacant homes across the country. A recent study showed 1.34 million homes across the country are sitting empty because speculators have bought them with no interest in ever living there, simply to speculate on the value. That's 8.7% of the housing stock. At our current rate of construction, it would take us 6 years to build the housing supply that we already have in vacant homes. Now, we have solutions that work. In Vancouver, for example, they've gradually raised their empty homes tax up to 3%. In doing so, they've reduced the number of vacant homes by 25%. They've added at least 18,000 units back onto the market. And they've generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue for new affordable housing. If we turn back to this bill, there's what's called an underused housing tax. It's set at 1%. For speculators who are earning returns well over 8%, my concern is that at this level, it won't meaningfully discourage the speculation from investors we're currently seeing in the market. Not only that, but almost everyone is exempt. Canadians are exempt. Permanent residents are exempt. Every corporation is exempt. It applies only to a small fraction of non-resident, non-Canadian owned vacant homes. And so it feels to me like we all know the house is on fire and someone's called up the fire service. We say, great, the fire service arrives and they've got a bucket of water. And I wonder why the governing party won't more quickly move to bring on the variety of tools we know we need to address this crisis, whether that's new investments in non-market public, subsidized and co-op housing. I noticed there was a promise in the platform of the governing party to introduce and consider an end to the blind bidding process. There are so many tools that we can and should consider, and I would strongly encourage the governing party to look to doing so if they're serious about addressing the housing crisis. And they're looking to set the priorities. I'd encourage at least looking at the tax that's in this bill to consider if we could be more serious about ensuring that this is a tool that would actually address the reality of the crisis that we're facing across the country, and that certainly in Kitchener is hitting home across our community. I'm also disappointed there was 2 other opportunities in Bill C-8 that weren't addressed that I'd like to bring forward here. The first is with respect to the crisis in long-term care. This past summer, I spoke with a woman whose mom had been waiting in hospital for 3 months. She's in tears as she shared with me if she'd wondered if her mom would make it to long-term care before she passed. She's one of 52,000 people on the wait list as of this past summer waiting to get a spot in long-term care. And the solutions are self-evident. In fact, last year, the former MP for Nanaimo, Ladysmith Paul, Manley introduced Motion 77 that offered a number of the potential solutions, including national standards on long-term care, an end to for-profit care, ensuring that personal support workers aren't providing 4 minutes of care a day, but 4 hours of care a day, eliminating the wait times altogether, and ensuring we have adequate pay so that PSWs don't have to run in the gig economy from one care home to the other. And thankfully, the Parliamentary Budget Officer costed the plan out. And the good news is that for less money than we currently offer to oil and gas companies, the $18 billion we offer to oil and gas companies every year, for less than that, we could be taking better care of our seniors. Finally, another disappointment for me that I would encourage the governing party, if not in this bill, then in another, to consider to prioritize, is to finally introduce a national pharmacare program. We've been hearing promises about pharmacare since 1997. It's 25 years. This past summer, I spoke with a woman, and she was sharing with me that given the cost of her medications, that she is needing to intentionally take less than she needs every day in order that her medications might last her longer. This in a country where we claim to be proud of truly universal health care, where obviously it's not the case. And because we've had this many years of study, we know that currently Canadians are spending $24 billion a year on pharmaceuticals. And we also know that we would save money by having a national program. Not only is it a more compassionate, a moral imperative, but economically, we would collectively save $4 billion a year by introducing a national pharmacare program. And so I would encourage the governing party, and in fact all parliamentarians, to continue to advocate for Canadians across the country who deserve access to truly universal health care. And one element of that is ensuring we have a national pharmacare program in the country. And so in closing then, again, there are elements of good propositions in this bill, and I'm glad for those, specifically around rapid tests in particular. In my community, that will really help. But if we're going to be serious about the housing crisis, and we're going to follow through on promises that have been made over years after years, I would encourage all parliamentarians to continue to advocate not only for improvements in long-term care and a national pharmacare program, but also to meaningfully address the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm welcoming my colleague from Kitchener to this House of Commons, and I'm going to gut check him here. And I know it's his first time he's elected in this House of Commons. We'll find out that when he presents misinformation to this House, and some of us are here that actually know that misinformation to be false, we will correct him. And in this question, I will ask him the $18 billion of subsidies that he has stated this government gives to the oil and gas sector, which is a complete falsity. We would like to hear him tell us where that $18 billion is allocated, or is it actually part of the credit? They've actually paid $500 billion over the last 20 years into federal government coffers, which is about $25 billion per year averaged out. So I would give him this opportunity to answer that question and make that correction.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
I appreciate the question from my honourable colleague from Calgary Centre, and I'd be happy to reiterate that these aren't numbers that are coming from me. This is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And they have already done the research with respect to the amount of funds that Export Development Canada currently allocates. It's around $13 billion a year. We purchased a pipeline for another $4 billion a year. In fact, we intend on spending many billions more in expanding that pipeline. And so I would encourage for the member across, I'd be glad to have a conversation not only about the dollar amounts, but more meaningfully how we could use those funds to reinvest where we need it most, and that's in workers across the country that are on the front lines, that either we allow them to go through an unjust disruption or we support them today to ensure that they have the supports they need to transition to the economy of the future.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech. From the beginning, he talked about the underused housing tax. At the Bloc Québécois, we fully agree with the principle, but we do have a bit of hesitation because this is federal interference in provincial jurisdiction. It seems that would be much more effective for the federal government to work in cooperation with municipalities and provide them with the information about those who own housing without living in it. And perhaps municipalities might want to increase property taxes further to go beyond what's currently in the bill and use their own infrastructure. I was wondering if he could talk more about this point. The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Merci bien à ma collègue de la Bloc Québécois pour sa...
Thank you to my colleague for the Bloc Québécois. It's impressive to me to observe over the last 2 months to hear the calls from the Bloc about jurisdictions between the province and the federal government.
I'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation. In my sense, we need all levels of government working together, which includes the leadership we're seeing from the cities of Vancouver and Toronto with respect to a vacancy tax, includes provinces stepping up. I think that's part of the conversation we then need to have to ensure that with respect to jurisdiction, we can move past and ensure that the funds are there, that all levels of government can invest in the affordable housing that we so desperately need.
Online to the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you very much to my colleague for his speech and for raising a number of the issues that he chose to raise in the context of this debate. He spoke of bringing a bucket of water to a fire that's raging out of control, and of course, one of the big problems that's not on the horizon anymore, but bad and getting worse is the problem of climate change and the climate crisis that we're facing. And this, of course, is the first kind of big opportunity for the government since the election to show its tangible intention when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. And, you know, I mean, when we're looking at Bill C-8, which is the legislative piece of that fall economic statement, we really don't see much at all about climate change. And so I'm wondering if the member wants to take a little bit of time to speak to what's required in order to combat the climate crisis and some of the things that the government might have done here in this bill in order to start getting serious about that now that it has, it's about as far away from an election as this government is going to get in the Parliament. Thank you.
And the member for Ottawa's Kitchener Centre with a very short answer, 30 seconds. Sir. So.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for the question from the honourable member from Elmwood-Transcona. I appreciate the question because it's so important that across every piece of legislation, that while we're in the midst of a climate emergency, this is an opportunity to ensure that the funds that are spoken about, when we talk about being a climate leader, that we need to actually follow through. And one of the ways we can do that, when we look at buildings across the country, we need to retrofit buildings right across the country, from workplaces to homes. And to do so, it's going to take significant investment, and it's also going to create millions of jobs while reducing energy poverty for those who need it most. Thank you.